In this lecture, we'll be looking at the death of Augustus and Tiberius' succession. We'll start by looking at the circumstances of Augustus' death and his plans for succession and the complications that arose, and then look closely at Tiberius' rise to power and his own reign, and finally conclude with a discussion of the presence of the Praetorian Guard in Rome. So the death of Augustus, 19th of August, 14 AD. Unlike so many others before him, he dies in a bed, not on the battlefield, not by being forced to commit suicide. He was 76 years old, and he'd ruled as princeps from 27 BC, that is the time of the first constitutional settlement, until 14 AD. So had had an extensive reign and plenty of time to accomplish quite a lot, to have a vision and to see that vision through. Reportedly, Augustus is said to have exclaimed in his final breaths, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." This is interesting in that he positions himself supposedly as an actor, as somebody who wasn't a real person, as somebody who was wearing a mask. And there's something about that in sort of the fact that he had changed his name. He had become somebody else after the civil wars, when he wanted to position himself as Augustus, the revered one, the one who pacified Rome. There were rumors that Tiberius had something to do with his death, that perhaps Livia was involved, but in general these rumors are discounted as that just the imagination of a historian who didn't like Tiberius too much. In all likelihood, Augustus died of natural causes of old age. He was, in fact, in poor health most of his life, and it's somewhat remarkable that he lived as long as he did. He died in Nola, down in southern Italy, and so his body needed to be brought back to Rome. There was an enormous funeral procession. You can imagine this was a several days journey, and you can imagine just the turnout for the beloved emperor. He was cremated near the mausoleum that he had built, and his ashes were interred in that mausoleum and remained there until Alaric's sack of Rome in the beginning of the 5th century. When the mausoleum was disrupted, the ashes were all thrown around. And immediately after Augustus's death, he was made a god. So following the example of Julius Caesar, who had been divinized, so was Augustus, and this would become regular practice for emperors after Augustus. Some highlights of Augustus's reign and his legacy, perhaps most important, was the formation of what we call the Principate. This is the form of government that replaced the Republic. So we have studied in this course then 3 forms of government in Rome: the monarchy, the republic, and now the Principate. In various ways, as you've seen, the Principate retains elements of the republic and refashions them, but has at its head a princeps. So it's kind of a mix of monarchy and republican forms of government. The Principate endured until the 5th century AD. It was modified for a brief time in the 3rd century by Diocletian when he introduced the Tetrarchy, and we'll be talking about that in some future lectures. But otherwise, we have the form of the Principate in place until the end of the Roman Empire in the West. So perhaps Augustus's greatest legacy was creating a very stable and replicable form of government. A key factor in being able to do so was just the length of his reign, the fact that he lived so long. Had he died in 23, it's very unlikely that we would have anything like the Principate. It's unclear who would have succeeded him. Probably we would have had more civil war. Who knows what would have happened. Because Augustus lived so long, he lived long enough for younger generations of Romans to have no memory of the Republic. Of course, there continued to persist a longing to restore the Republic, particularly among the senatorial aristocracy, and that really wouldn't go away. Even under Trajan, we would still have a longing to restore the Republic. But they no longer have a memory of living in the Republic, and that's important. So it's just stories that they've heard. So that becomes a key factor in consolidating the Principate as a form of government. Augustus engaged in an extensive building program in Rome and in the provinces. Again, the length of his reign, the fact that he had tremendous wealth at his fingertips, in part because of the provincial holdings, Egypt in particular. This funded an enormous building project in Rome. When he says he left a city of marble, he in fact did so. But there were also extensive building projects throughout the Roman provinces under Augustus. He instituted a system of taxation that was less abusive to the provinces, so we now have a system of direct taxation where the collection is carried out by civil servants, by employees of Rome. So there was the necessity for an expanded bureaucracy, but taxes were now collected by Rome itself, by a kind of ancient IRS, rather than by those syndicates, the publicani, which tended to abuse their rights to collect taxes and were in cahoots with governors in abusing provincials. So one of the reasons that Augustus was seen as favorable by provincials was in fact the change to taxation. Nobody liked to pay taxes, but they at least preferred to pay fair taxes. And the fact that Augustus engaged in such massive building programs, not just nice public buildings, baths, circuses, amphitheaters, but also building aqueducts, building roads, things that just made daily life easier. The month of Sextilis was renamed after Augustus, so it's where we get August from. Remember, Quintilis was renamed after Caesar, so Julius Caesar, we get July, and Sextilis was renamed Augustus, August. Tiberius succeeds Augustus, and the indication of his announcement that he will accept the role as princeps was his willingness to deliver the funeral eulogy for Augustus and the privilege of doing so. So Tiberius, then the stepson of Augustus, he was the natural son of Tiberius's wife Livia, delivers the funeral eulogy for Augustus. And on the 18th of September, 14 AD, the Senate confirmed Tiberius as princeps. So it announced that it would accept Augustus's plan of succession. It's also around this time, perhaps even just prior to the death of Augustus, certainly in the days after, that Augustus's exiled grandson, Posthumus Agrippa, was murdered. And this was a necessary evil to prevent Posthumus from coming back to Rome and challenging Tiberius for the Principate. So it was important, and it probably was carried out on Augustus's order, that this succession happened peacefully. It was one thing to set up the Principate. Augustus recognized the important thing was making sure that there was a safe and peaceful transition of power. In order to do that, he needed to make sure that any possible rivals, like Posthumus Agrippa, were disposed of. And on the left-hand side of your slide, you have an image of Tiberius. So the problem of succession was on Augustus's mind very early on, certainly as early as 23. So early on, he recognized that he had a twofold task. The first was to consolidate his power after Actium, and the second was to come up with a viable plan of transferring that power to a successor. Initially, in 23, he didn't have anybody to succeed him. He didn't have a son. He had one daughter by his first wife, Scribonia, but he didn't have any sons. So initially, the plan seems to have been to transfer power to Agrippa in the case of his death. One of the things that this did was ease concerns among Romans that he was planning a hereditary monarchy. He probably was planning a hereditary monarchy, and certainly the construction of the mausoleum around this time suggests that he was. But initially at least, he recognizes that he needs to alleviate those concerns. But he does put in motion a plan to create a hereditary monarchy when he has Agrippa marry his daughter Julia. And the plan then is for the children of this marriage to be Augustus's successors. He adopts his grandsons Lucius and Gaius and imagines that one or the other of them is going to succeed him. He never imagines that he's going to live as long as he does. He also shows significant favor to his stepsons Drusus and Tiberius. So he's got 4 male relatives that are lined up in sort of various orders of rank to succeed him. And he believes now that he's got a safe plan of family succession. And here you have on this image, this is from the Altar of Peace, the Arapakis. One of the panels actually shows Agrippa and Julia with one of their children. So highlighting again that plan of succession even for the Roman people in this very public way. Unfortunately, Agrippa died in 12 BC, and this forced Tiberius to divorce his wife and marry Julia. So we get lots of sort of family marriage. But when Agrippa dies, leaving Julia a widow, Augustus doesn't want this. He makes sure that Tiberius then marries Julia to prevent, very clearly, Julia from marrying anybody else or producing children with anybody outside the family that would then challenge one of Augustus's adopted heirs for power. In 6 BC, Tiberius leaves Rome. So one of the interesting things about Tiberius is that despite the fact that early on he is shown favor by Augustus, he's not identified as a potential heir, really. He's given certain kinds of offices, certain kinds of powers, but he's never really a favored son. And he recognizes that, and it's unclear whether he wanted to be. He seems unhappy in Rome for various reasons. Unfortunately, the historian that treats his reign in the most detail is not favorably disposed to him, so it's unclear to us exactly why he leaves Rome. Some of the theories include he's unhappy in the marriage, particularly to Julia. Julia doesn't go with him when he leaves Rome and goes to Capri in southern Italy. He seems to have a tense relationship with Livia, although that may be a figment of Tacitus, the historian's imagination. It may also really just be that he disliked politics, that it just wasn't for him. He was a military man. It's not clear that he was jealous of Augustus's grandsons, although that theory has also been floated. In 4 AD, though, Tiberius is forced to come back to Rome from Capri. And if you've ever been to Capri down on the Bay of Naples, you can appreciate what a difficulty this was for Tiberius, where he had this beautiful villa that you can actually visit on the cliffs of Capri. But in 4 AD, he's recalled to Rome after the deaths of everybody else who could have succeeded Augustus. Lucius and Gaius both die, and Drusus as well. Augustus is absolutely devastated by this. He really had banked on the fact that either Lucius or Gaius would be his heir, and when they die as young men, he is absolutely just devastated. He responds, though, by recognizing that Tiberius is his only choice. He's not willing to go outside the family, so he adopts Tiberius legally and gives him tribunician powers, and tribunician power was in some ways the mark of a successor. This was the power that was given to somebody to mark them as a successor. He also made Tiberius proconsul, so gave him the authority of a consul, but it was that tribunician power that marked him as Augustus's successor. And in 13 AD, so in the year before Augustus's death, but probably when Augustus's health was failing, Augustus gives him an equal share of Maius Imperium. So in other words, makes him his equal. And that is when we see, in fact, the formal transference of power happening. It needs to be ratified by the Senate, but it in fact happens in 13. So after Augustus's death, Tiberius takes office, and it's a smooth transition. It's exactly what Augustus wanted, and it happens in some ways against all odds. Every other heir Augustus had hoped for dies, but fortunately Tiberius does outlive him. Tiberius has quite a long rule, from 14 to 37 AD. He's the first of 4 Julio-Claudian emperors, so these members of Augustus's family that ruled Rome from 14 to 68 AD, and so the Nero will be the last of the Julio-Claudians, but this is, in fact, the family dynasty that Augustus imagined. Tiberius didn't like Rome. He spent a lot of time away, particularly in Capri, and the image on the left-hand side is the remains of Tiberius's villa on the cliffs of Capri, and this photo doesn't quite do justice to the amazing views. You can imagine this is at the top of a very high cliff looking out over the beautiful Bay of Naples. And Capri is still an exotic island for the rich and famous. There are various theories about why Tiberius didn't want to be in Rome. Historians that are not particularly fond of Tiberius claim that he was secretive, paranoid, indulging in orgies, that he was, basically a degenerate. More likely, he just didn't like politics, and he didn't like being in the middle of things in Rome. He spent the last decade of his reign exclusively at Capri, and unfortunately, in his absence, there was a kind of vacuum of power that various other people tried to fill, and it was this vacuum of power that seems to have fueled, in particular, a just absolute explosion in treason trials, where people would bring charges of treason against their enemies, and people were put to death as a result. And this was really an abuse of the law courts that was allowed to happen in part because of Tiberius's absence. Tiberius was much more interested in military affairs. He always had been. He was successful as a military man, and was particularly interested in subduing the Germanic troops along the Rhine, in securing that Rhine frontier. This was the area of the Roman Empire he knew best, where he'd served successfully, and where he focused his attentions. Tiberius differed from Augustus in some significant ways, and in some ways that led to not having a very good post-mortem reputation. And you can see Tiberius on coinage here, so he was at least able to circulate coinage with his image on it. But unlike Augustus, he did not sponsor public games or large-scale building projects. Part of this was just Augustus had bankrupted the treasury. I mean, Augustus had spent a lot of money, and Tiberius was interested in shoring things up. But the Roman people didn't like this very much. One of the roles of the princeps was now to be the patron of the city, and Tiberius was not fulfilling that role. He was not sponsoring public games the way that Augustus did. In 34, there was a pretty significant fire in Rome, and Tiberius declined to expend very much money engaged in rebuilding. So, in fact, chose once again to try to shore up Rome's finances after Augustus's spending spree. The other key thing about Tiberius's reign is the increased visibility of the Praetorian Guard, and this frieze on the left-hand side is just giving you an image of what the Guard would have looked like. The Praetorian Guard was an old Republican institution. It was not something invented by Augustus, but it was typically used by generals on campaign. And what it really was just a personal guard, and the Praetorian, the Praetorius was a camp. It was the general's tent. So what it was in its original instantiation really was just the guard that stood around the general's tent and made sure that he wasn't killed either by a revolt of his own men or by a secret attack by the enemy. So, and it was generally used on military campaigns, so it had a military connection. Augustus created a Praetorian Guard for himself in Rome and had this operating in Rome, but it was a very small number, and most of it was stationed outside of Rome, in the cities around Rome. It was no real threat. There wasn't any threat that this group could carry out any kind of military attack. But under Tiberius, we get a very powerful Praetorian prefect, so the leader of the Praetorian Guard, looking out for the status of the Praetorian Guard. And this prefect was named Sejanus. And Sejanus's activities are well documented by Tacitus, but probably the most important thing that Sejanus saw to was the construction of a camp, the Castra Praetoria, that was constructed. It was a permanent camp just outside the city walls of Rome. So now we have not just a large Praetorian Guard, but a Praetorian Guard that is stationed, for all intents and purposes, in Rome. That is now, in fact, a significant presence and threat to Rome. It was a 24-hour palace guard.